New York Jets QB decisions, and is the NFL less competitive than ever, as Tom Brady says? That's what we're going to talk about today on a day early special edition, Thanksgiving edition. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you guys of Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals, the newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. You can find all of Sean's fantastic work. With me, as always, Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work over at RotoViz. I guess, Sean, we can definitely start by wishing all of the listeners a happy Thanksgiving. We are very thankful for all of you for listening along with us, for the feedback, for the interactions, the conversations. It really is a blast. Sean and I often talk about things typically that flow through me that I hear from you guys, but I'm always bringing them back to him, and we end up doing a lot of the stuff on the show based on where we are hearing the most feedback and those things. We really appreciate the back and forth with all of you guys and those of you who listen to all of our shows. So happy Thanksgiving to everyone this week. Sean, one of the big topics is the Jets turning to Tim Boyle. And I just got to start because you just told me before the show the funniest stat I have ever heard. So please. There's a lot of talk on Twitter that like Tim Boyle might be the only quarterback in the NFL worse than Zach Wilson. And I'm like, yeah, he was bad in college, this, that, and the other thing. But you just told me a stat about his college statistics. What was that stat?
Well, Ben, if we ignore the time at Eastern Kentucky, where he also had more interceptions than touchdowns, but we focus on his collegiate career at Connecticut and his handful of starts in the NFL. Tim Boyle's touchdown to interception ratio is 4-22.
This is a guy in the NFL, and 3 of those TDs have come at the NFL level. So the other, he played for 3 years at Connecticut and transferred to Eastern Kentucky because he couldn't hack it at Connecticut. And Sean, while we were doing this research, he won 3 high school championships. So maybe this is all just coming back from when he was a high school guy. But he played 3 years at Connecticut, and he had a 1-13 interception ratio in 3 years of major college football. It's insane.
It appears that he threw 11 touchdowns to 13 interceptions in what appears to be his 5th year in college at Eastern Kentucky. And then, he immediately made the Green Bay Packers. We're not talking about like practice squad or whatnot. He made the Green Bay Packers out of college based on that track record. Now, Boyle is 6'3", 230, reasonably athletic for all that, a 4.77 740, a 35.5-inch vertical, 704 3-cone. This is a big guy who, probably can move around okay, although you were also joking before the show, it hasn't translated into rushing numbers at any level either.
And my favorite joke from you before the show was that he might legitimately be the worst quarterback to ever start an NFL game this week. But then you corrected yourself and said, well, probably the version of him that started games for the Detroit Lions prior when he was a little bit less experienced. So the current one from the New York Jets, slightly better quarterback than the formerly starting younger Tim Boyle. It's not great, Sean. The reason we bring up and start the show today with Tim Boyle is obviously that the Jets have benched Zach Wilson. They are going forward with Tim Boyle. There's a lot of people on Twitter and elsewhere that have been arguing a lot that this is not all on Zach Wilson. That has been Robert Saleh's line. It's not all on the quarterback. That has been parroted by some of the media, and it has been parroted into my mentions on Twitter and elsewhere, which is why readers of Stealing Signals will know I have been spending a lot of time really hammering Zach Wilson, probably a little bit more than I maybe should have.
Ben, who is it on? Just in case, my question for you, as someone who does watch all of the games, and, potentially it's also on Nathaniel Hackett, who is coming off of, as Sean Payton would tell you, the worst coaching job in NFL history. So there's another maybe scapegoat there who has not been fired, which does give you a little sense about the seriousness of this team when the Steelers, a better and more functional offense than the Jets, they did fire their offensive coordinator. Now, again, we know this all stems back to Aaron Rodgers, so it's very apples and oranges. But who is it on if it's not on Zach Wilson?
It seems Nathaniel Hackett seems to be one of the arguments. The offensive line is another one I hear a ton about. They haven't been good. Part of my argument has been that Zach Wilson has probably the worst pocket presence of any quarterback that I can ever remember watching. We joke a lot, obviously, that he likes to turn and run backwards. And then when he started to actually stand in the pocket, he started taking a ton of sacks. We talk about Sam Howell and we write off those sacks, and there would maybe be some criticism of our bias in that regard. The difference is
what I was going to bring up, though, is that Sam Howell has dealt with this issue and leads the NFL in passing yards.
Right. So Sam Howell takes the sacks. Right. Sam Howell takes the sacks, and then what you get as the trade-off is big plays. It was also a criticism of Russell Wilson during his best seasons with Seattle. What you got as a trade-off was elite per attempt efficiency. Yes, you would have liked throwaways instead of sacks, and then his per attempt efficiency coming down because there's more incompletions. But the trade-off of him extending plays in his best years in Seattle was always that he had the ability to hit downfield. And if you go look at his per attempt efficiency, you go look at the yards per target of his top receivers, it was incredible. And a lot of that was...
And, that I'm not a big Russell Wilson fan really from the beginning and certainly now, but to just give him credit for what he's actually done. You talk about the offensive line. There are games in there. Like there's this game against the Arizona Cardinals that's seared in my memory where they were continually sacking him before he finished his drop. Right. And Russell Wilson still would battle through and make all these great plays and lead his team to the Super Bowl.
Yep. The difference with Zach Wilson, and his sack rate isn't even, the largest sack rate in the history of the world, but is when he started to stand in the pocket more and take more sacks, there was no benefit to that. There was no positive trade-off. His yards per attempt, his adjusted yards per attempt, all those things, not good in basically any game this season. There's a couple, the Kansas City game, he looked like vaguely reasonable. That was the first game where he started standing in the pocket. And then literally the next week, teams were like, oh, you're not going to just bail out of the pocket and we can just get you, get pressure on you in the pocket and it's over. And so they started doing that. And then everyone started talking about the offensive line. Basically, since that point where Zach Wilson stopped bailing and standing in there and his sacks went up, everyone's been blaming the offensive line. So those are the two parts that have been criticized. The counters, I think, maybe not for the offensive line, but certainly for the Hackett thing, are the rest of Zach Wilson's career. And we've been saying really since week one, since Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles and your whole plan is up in smoke. And we got a lot of Zach Wilson in week one because Rodgers tears his Achilles immediately. And he clearly in week one looked like he had not made any adjustments. I was already there's the possibility that he actually got better over the offseason. But we saw this all of last year, and they needed to get rid of him last year. And Robert Saleh was answering questions in about week 13, 14, 15 last year, where he kept saying Zach Wilson's our quarterback. And they were in a little bit of a playoff push last year because their defense was good last year. And he kept sticking with Zach Wilson at a time when it made no sense other than in the context of you needed to know in year two, and it probably wasn't a year where you were going to go on and win the Super Bowl or anything, even though if they were vaguely in the playoff race, they weren't actually good enough last year. You needed to know if Zach Wilson was a guy. So I did understand last year, and I remember arguing it a little bit. You let him play out year two a little bit because then you decide in the offseason if he's your guy, and they decided. They did that. They let him play it out, and then they went and they got Aaron Rodgers. But once Aaron Rodgers goes down, everything has to change. And our argument,
when you're thinking about that too, is there is this issue where they just built everything around the idea that the quarterback had to stay healthy. Now, in their defense, almost every NFL team does that. But it's not just the problem of them bringing in Aaron Rodgers' washed-up teammates. And it's not just the problem of bringing in his offensive coordinator who should not be employed at the NFL level. But it's also a thing where they did not actually want Zach Wilson to really be the backup. I mean, he's not the number 2 on this team because he's the backup per se. They're trying to stash him and keep him through this season because they used the number 2 pick on him, which all of those things, I mean, we're talking about a bunch of cascade problems where downstream you have all of these terrible effects because of original decisions that you weren't willing to get away from. I mean, your backup quarterback cannot be a stash. It has to be somebody who could legitimately get in there and play.
Yeah. So it's a great point. There's your sunk cost fallacy. And then you get the element of even your number 3 quarterback was a similar issue. It's Tim Boyle, who was Rodgers' backup in Green Bay, and it's another Rodgers buddy that they brought in, and that's been the whole discussion. And that's the other thing that gets blamed here is all of the non-Garrett Wilson receivers are, basically Rodgers buddies as well, and are not good. And I understand that's a legitimate argument as well, but Garrett Wilson is good, and he's gotten open a lot of times this season. We've talked about this. Zach Wilson has missed him. There have been, we're biased around here, what have you, but the point.
Breece Hall has been arguably the best receiving back in the NFL, which I think gets missed a little bit, is just how extraordinary he's been, even with what Breece Hall has done specifically in the receiving game, which has been more impressive than what he's done as a runner. The passing offense still completely dysfunctional.
Right. Just it can't exist like this for this long. And so the argument we made a lot, and I know I've written a lot in Stealing Signals about this idea that the Jets had to be willing to try a lot of different things because immediately it was clear from week 1 that it was not going to be Zach Wilson. And now they're going to Tim Boyle. And I joked to you before, it does feel a little bit like they're trying to prove that it wasn't just Zach Wilson by going to the least competent alternative. And I do think there's a real possibility that Tim Boyle looks horrible in a way that will allow people to get even louder that it wasn't Zach Wilson's fault. The only guy they've added is Trevor Siemian, who they had on the practice squad. Trevor Siemian has never really been a particularly great quarterback. There were times when he had good weapons in Denver where his ability to just navigate the offense and get the ball out quick worked, and he was at least accurate enough. He had some good games with, like, I believe Emmanuel Sanders was one of the top receivers at the time. And he's the guy that I would be most interested in seeing, I guess, even more so than Tim Boyle. And I was like a little bit interested in the fact that they are demoting Zach Wilson all the way to QB3, and Siemian will be activated or has been activated from the practice squad and will be the backup. Maybe if Boyle's so bad that he gets benched, then we'll get to see Siemian. I don't know, but that's probably not going to happen based on the way that they played with Zach Wilson. They're probably going to play Boyle. Boyle's probably going to be bad. But the point, Sean, and we're holding out hope a little bit. You and I are trying to find something in Tim Boyle's game long, because you legitimately can't play the quarterback position worse than Zach Wilson did. Like, there is, as good as their defense has been, there is like no question that like the Jets should be better than they are. They've won 2 of their 4 games in overtime. They've gotten really good fortune on those. They win on a punt return TD against the Bills. The Giants miss a field goal that would basically put the game away in regulation, and the Jets are able to get into field goal range. It's probably the best thing Zach Wilson did all year, is in like 2 plays, he got them into field goal range of that Giants game. They kicked the field goal, and they're able to win in overtime on a field goal. Those 2 games were like basically very lucky wins, is the way that I would put it. They've had some other losses, though, that you can easily, like the loss at the Raiders, they lose by 4. Like, any competent QB play throughout that game, that should have been a win. The loss against the Patriots at home in week 3, they scored 10 points. They have 171 yards of total offense. Again, if you're able to move the ball at all, that should be a win. But there's even some of these games. I wrote about the Chargers game, which was recent. It was on national TV on Monday Night Football. People watched that. They lost that Chargers game 27-6. I know a lot of people will say, well, I mean, what quarterback were you going to find that was going to turn a 21-point loss into a win? But the way that game played out, I mean, first of all, the Chargers scored their final TD after a strip sack, returned to the 2-yard line, short Austin Eckler touchdown. Before that, it was 20-6. The Chargers got an early punt return, and they basically didn't play offense in that game. The Chargers just packed it in. We're like, we're going to not lose because the Jets can't beat us. They had 191 total yards of offense, 107 net yards passing. That's got to be one of the lowest numbers in Justin Herbert's career. And they still won by 21. The point, again, is we don't know how this game would have played out if there was a competent offense that could have put some pressure on the Chargers and made them play offense. If the Jets were able to score some points in the first half of that game, it isn't a 21-point loss, that's for sure. And the Chargers have to do some things differently, and potentially, even with the early punt return, the Chargers offense isn't able to build enough offensively. We've seen the Chargers in a lot of other games not be able to close these games. That's another game that I would point to and say, you just gave games away, and you did it from week 1 through now. And you did it because of the sunk cost fallacy that you're just talking about, Sean. But one of the things that I want to spin this into fantasy about, and I realized this while writing, and I wanted to get your thoughts on as well. But this idea of like roster churn at the back of rosters and on waivers, and it's not as applicable now. We're towards the end of the year, but when we think ahead to 2024 and some of these years or future years, and just like thinking about fantasy as a strategic game, roster churn is something that we talk about. It's good to be, churning those back ends and taking new swings and stuff. But one of the things that happens is sometimes you cut a guy too early, right? Like you and I were talking just recently that we have a team where we cut both Kyler Murray and Trey McBride early in the year, and that hurts when you look back on it. But we cut them in like September. And we cut them in September because it was a deep roster at that time, and we needed to be able to make the other small bets. And so the idea here, and the way that I'm tying this back to the Jets, is I think by now the Jets should have tried 6 different quarterbacks if they had to. They would have had to do them quickly. These guys would not have had time to learn the playbook. That is not impossible. We've seen it with Josh Dobbs, both with the Cardinals and the Vikings this year. We've seen it with other quarterbacks, not just Josh Dobbs. We've seen it with a lot of quarterbacks. Josh Johnson is another one that came to my mind when I was writing this year, where he had multiple 300-yard games. I think just last season with 2 different teams, 300-yard games. I think the Ravens and the 49ers, where he like stepped in and started from multiple teams last year. We've seen it with a lot of different types of quarterbacks that are able to get up to speed relatively quickly and at least show competence, better than what Zach Wilson showed. And then you would know, okay, we have upside here. Circling that back to the roster churn idea, it's the same concept, I think, where every week you're trying to make a bet that for that given week, whether it was Keaton Mitchell a couple weeks ago, Jaleel McLaughlin several weeks prior to that, there's a little bit of an increase in the upside probability, right? Like maybe it's 1% of hitting in any given week. But for certain players, certain weeks, there's things working in their favor that they're like 3% that week. And if you're churning every week, and then when you do see the positive signs, you stick with those guys. But if you don't, you're willing to just dump them, and maybe you'll regret cutting them too early, which is the other element. With the Jets, if they're getting these quick looks at 6 different quarterbacks, my whole plan here, yeah, maybe you give up on a guy too quick as well, but you have to be willing to cut early and churn, because you can't just play the string out forever like you did with Zach Wilson last year and you did again this year. You have to see something. You have to be something that makes you think the probability is increasing. We're talking about these narrow shifts in probabilistic range, and it's not an easy concept to grasp. But if you do that, to get back to the fantasy point, if you do that all year, you've now stacked a bunch of bets, and now your probability of hitting something with that roster spot over the course of a year is higher than if you just stashed one guy all year who had a certain probability of breaking out at some point. There are some profiles that their probability of breaking out at some point, if you just stash them, is probably higher than even the waiver churn guys. So I don't want to get too out of control, like the JSNs of the world. That his profile, you just want to stash because you don't know when it's going to come, but it does have a higher hit rate. And again, these are all like hard things to quantify.
It seems like the listeners want to know why you won't let me cut Treylon Burks.
Have I not yeah, we should cut Treylon Burks. You've definitely beat me at my own game here. But the Jets should have done this at quarterback. It's what we try to do in fantasy. It's leaning into uncertainty, but it's compounding uncertain bets, multiple uncertain bets, right? And all in the case of the Jets that it took was recognizing they've already seen it with Zach Wilson last year. It was not going to come. He was not going to turn a corner. You waited until week 12, and now you're going to Tim Boyle, which is probably another wasted, period. Like we can look at his profile and make it. We just were laughing about he had 1 TD pass in 3 years at Connecticut, 13 interceptions. He didn't actually play a ton, but he was terrible. And then he went on to Eastern Kentucky, and he still had more interceptions than TDs. And since he went to the pros, as you noted, he's been the same guy. A lot of interceptions, not a lot of touchdowns. That's not the guy that you want just because he's 6'4" and vaguely athletic. Not the guy that you want playing quarterback at this point. Some of the guys that I've thrown out there that are on practice squads are like the CFL's, star Nathan Rourke, who had the awesome play in the preseason. And, guys like that, the Doug Flutie of our time, go give him a chance, right? Do something interesting. Somebody who can threaten, somebody who can extend play, somebody who can stand in a pocket. And even if the offensive line's not good, make a read and deliver a football. Those are things that even if they don't know the playbook particularly well, you're going to be able to see, because Zach Wilson, you can see from watching one game of him that he cannot read defenses. People who don't know football text me and say, This guy is horrible. How did you not tell me he was even worse than you've been telling me? So anyway, Sean, it's a lot of thoughts, but it was something I wanted to get into, and I apologize to listeners. I like to go on my little rants for going on such a rant and not letting you kind of chime in here. But this idea of compounding possible returns, it reminded me of the waiver churn concept. It's leaning into uncertainty. It's making a lot of small bets with the same cost, right? Like one roster spot can make a lot of small bets in fantasy. For the Jets, rather than starting Zach Wilson, which is one bet for 12 weeks, you could have made 6 different bets, like I said, and you could have let a bunch of different quarterbacks start for 2 different weeks. You have to be willing to lean into the uncertainty. You have to see uncertainty as an opportunity, not as a risk. In this case, the certainty of Zach Wilson was the risk. To your example, the certainty of Treylon Burks is probably not great at this point, right? Like, we don't have any reason to believe that the Tennessee Titans are going to be a good passing offense anytime soon, even if Burks can get healthy, but he also can't get healthy. We should be trying some uncertain things with that roster spot. I think you're right.
So many sort of interesting notes there. And I do want to give, we don't think this is a great move. And yet at the same time, I'm excited for it. I'm excited to somebody else. You love to have those underdog stories. You love to, see these situations where people fail and don't give up and fight through it. Maybe there is some athletic talent that gives you the chance to fight through. Somebody who, is my size and speed and arm strength is never going to be able to fight through to play in the NFL. But Tim Boyle has successfully. I do think it's interesting that it's not just this Jets team, right? We talk about him making the Green Bay Packers directly out of that horrible college play. And yet the team that he started 3 games for was the Detroit Lions in 2021. And the tiny interesting note there is that in his final start with them, he threw for 262 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, he completed fewer than 60% of his passes. He threw 3 more picks. I'm not saying it was a good game, but from a fantasy perspective, a game like that would be more interesting than what we're getting. He ends up last year with the Chicago Bears and throws a few passes in week 18. So that's yet another team that wanted to take a chance on him. Now, in that game, he did throw as many interceptions as he threw completions. So again, we're not getting great play, but another NFL team that's kind of vouching for him. And then obviously now he's going to get the situation with the New York Jets. I'm rooting for him. I hope that this works out well. Some other teams who have done some similar things to what you're actually talking about, which I do think are interesting. And you certainly wonder about the Cleveland Browns, who, trade Joshua Dobbs, who was the perfect fit for, kind of where they are now, and probably actually a better player this year than Deshaun Watson. But they've got a couple of interesting guys who are now there on that team that they can kind of move through as they're trying to deal with their quarterback situation. They actually take maybe the riskier path last week, which I think gets criticized, and yet at the same time is interesting, right? They go with Dorian Thompson-Robinson. He doesn't have a good game, right? Throws for only 165 yards, below 4 yards per attempt, which seems almost impossible. Throws a pick, but they win, in part because on the other side of that game, we get another team and another QB who cannot average 4 yards per attempt. Can he pick at 15 for 28 in that one with the 3 sacks? The Cleveland Browns continue to do, and Kevin Stefanski continues to do a lot of interesting things, and they're 7-3, even though a lot of those things have not worked. And when we think about being risk averse, we think about embracing a wide range of outcomes, and we think about trying enough things that some of them can hit. I do like what the Browns are doing here, and that, have they been lucky to win some of these games on the back of their defense? Almost certainly. But this is also an organization that will take chances, that will do things, and some of them are turning out very nicely. The Cleveland Browns, if they're in the Super Bowl in 2024, I don't think that is necessarily a surprise. This is a good and interesting organization there. The other thing, as you talk about, churning the waivers, that you think back to, and one of the reasons why when we had the discussion about Keaton Mitchell, I said, probably it's not going to work, but I think you have to take that shot. And one of the reasons you want to follow Ben's work, one of the reasons why I think the Zero RB universe that I write is kind of interesting is that, I mean, you're trying to look ahead on some of these guys too, maybe stash them before they become a $300 dollar bet. But certainly when you have some of the lower down guys hit, I think you want to churn and get on them, even though you're going to hear everybody say, well, that's a fluky performance. That's a fluky performance. That's not going to be sustainable. Everybody knows that scoring a long touchdown is not sustainable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, yeah, that is true. And yet, if you wait for the evidence that definitively demonstrates that as a guy you want, somebody else will have that player 3 or 4 weeks ago. And a team that is a very good example of that this year will be the Houston Texans, right? If you're going to wait for the Texans to confirm that CJ Stroud is real and then it's going to filter down to his receivers, then you don't have those guys on your team. And so we want to make sure that we're using the bottom of the roster in an interesting way and in a way that is more than just saying, okay, well, these are the guys I'm going to make the bet on preseason, and I hope I hit on Puka. Now, if you hit on Puka, then you're in great shape, right? But you want to be structuring it so you have multiple shots at it. And one of the things that's kind of interesting here as I'm looking at these stats with, obviously Sam Howell leading the NFL in passing, is that the other names that are up there in that group are generally guys who were available at the end of drafts. You have Josh Allen up there with Sam Howell, CJ Stroud, Tua, who's more of a middle round pick, Jared Goff, and Brock Purdy. I mean, those are a lot of the names that we recommended as your sort of Frankenstein QB. Now, a couple of the other names that we recommended definitely did not hit, like a Kenny Pickett and a Desmond Ridder, and especially me on the Ridder side. But if you have put your roster together with a variety of those names and multiple guys and had the humility to say, I don't know for sure which one is going to be the guy who hits. I mean, Ben, right now, a lot of our rosters have like 3 of the top 6 or 7 players in passing yards right now. And so now you've got an interesting weekly decision, which was stressful for us the last couple of weeks, but it's much better to be stressful with good decisions than have no stress because you're starting a guy who doesn't give you a chance to compete with the elite quarterbacks. So from both a reality perspective and a fantasy perspective, I think those notes that you're making there about trying some different things, chasing the hot player, then letting it develop and see if it's going to work for you are exactly the way that you need to approach this. And even to the point where, and again, I mean, some of this is just picking out things where you're like, yeah, I mean, a certain player hit, a different certain player missed. That's going to always happen. But you think about the New England Patriots, and one of the problems that they're dealing with right now is sort of a lack of variety among the QBs that they could potentially start to pull them out of the situation that they're in. Now, my take on this would be is that we have enough information on Mac Jones to feel like in his case, it is coaching and it is teammates. And you say, well, he's been so bad that it can't just be that. And I think that, yeah, that's in part true. But if you're a competitor, you're going to start to make increasingly egregious mistakes as you try and fight through the terrible situation. Is Mac Jones going to be a viable NFL starter in the future? I think that's a tough call. I do think that Mac Jones sticks and ends up, if nothing else, being a Ryan Fitzpatrick type at some time in the future with a different organization. But you look back to where they are right now, where they really also can't play Bailey Zappi, and they took him 7 picks ahead of Sam Howell. And when you're working through this here, I think you want to take the most straightforward approach, the guy with the best upside. But the other thing that the Patriots could have done, and another thing people are going to say is like you have a limited number of roster spots, even with your undrafted free agents, and you're going to have to balance positions at the NFL level. You can't just like trade down, make 30 picks and keep 150 players. That's not the way that it works. But the Patriots had 10 selections in that draft, in part because of the way they do trade throughout drafts. And so if you're going to make this late pick at QB and try and create contingent upside, try and benefit from a wide range of outcomes, maybe taking a couple of the late QBs is the way to go there. So not saying they necessarily did it wrong, other than from looking back and the fact that we really like Sam Howell, and when we were doing the live show together, we were stunned when Howell fell below another QB. But there were interesting things about Bailey Zappi's profile, much more so than, say, a Tim Boyle. So you can understand why they did that. And yet, I think as you work through this idea of drafting QBs, and you think about, even like an Aiden O'Connell and some of the guys who do look like they might be interesting players down the line. You think about what the 49ers did with Brock Purdy. Certainly giving yourself options, both in fantasy and in reality, is a crucial part of building long-term success.
That is maybe one of the keys of the shift we've seen in NFL coaching in the last several years. The expansion of the coaching pool, younger candidates, more perspectives getting in the rooms. Shawn, you brought up to me before the show the Tom Brady comments were interesting. He kind of turns in retirement here into the back in my day player who had a big comment that there's a lot of mediocrity around the NFL these days, that these players are not learning how to play the right way, that a lot of the flags, a lot of the issues of player safety stuff, some of the stuff for me with the player safety was just so silly. He used to be able to throw receivers away from stuff. And, if he saw Ray Lewis over the middle, he wouldn't throw a pass over the middle. And it's like, okay, yeah, but also get over yourself a little bit. I know you're Tom Brady, but come on. I'm sure there's somebody could cut up some clips of Tom Brady throwing some passes where he hung out some receivers to dry. And it's not, he made the way that he framed it in one comment was like, I wouldn't throw this pass because then I know I'm losing that receiver for the day. And it's like, your receivers are not chess pieces. That's their health that we're talking about here. And I don't want to play in a league where we have to rely on Tom Brady level quarterbacking for the receivers to not be lost for the day or be knocked from the game or have their career. There's at no point, even in Tom Brady's years, were there 32 quarterbacks capable of protecting the receivers. It shouldn't be on the quarterback to protect the receivers. There should be some of these rules in place. You guys know how I feel about the player safety stuff. If we're serious about NFL players, I see a lot of the same guys that are like, oh, running backs need to get paid. And you guys who talk about running backs don't matter, this, that, and the other thing. They're the same people that are also like, well, football is soft and we need to be able to take headshots at every football player on the field. And it's like, do you care about players or not? I care about guaranteed contracts, and I also care about creating rules that protect them. I don't really care if Tom Brady thinks that defenses are soft. I don't really care about the people that are like, how else are they going to tackle them if they can't hip drop? Well, figure something out. But if it has 25 times the injury rate, then take that tackle out, and then they'll have to figure something else out. I don't care what they figure out. If they all have to run around and get in front of the defender and not tackle from behind, because what I keep hearing is it'll be impossible to tackle from behind, I'm fine with that. Do we really care if you are not able to tackle from behind and offenses score more points? Why do we care about it? Why is this something we need to legislate out of the game? NBA is getting so many positive reviews and all these things about the way that their product has advanced in the last decade plus. And it's because I just saw the other day they had one of their games had the highest over-under since 1995. In the 2000s when I was still watching the NBA regularly because the Sonics hadn't left Seattle yet, RIP, the teams didn't score a lot of points. One of the huge things that they've been able to do in the NBA and some of the advancements in three-point shooting and all that, but it's been way more about efficiency and scoring points and doing fun stuff, putting points on the board, right? And you have
last game I attended in person finished in the 80s. I believe there was a game yesterday that finished with both teams in the 150s.
Right. I think that's the game you're with the high over under that I'm referring to, because I saw that they were going to break that over under, and I think they did. I saw a tweet at halftime that they were already 60% of the way to this total that was the highest total ever. And anyway, that's smart. The NBA has leaned into the things that fans want to see. That fantasy is a massive part of all of this, right? It's gotten bigger. Fantasy basketball has gotten way bigger as basketball has gotten more interesting. DFS basketball has gotten way bigger. It's not just because basketball has gotten more interesting, but it makes it more fun to play, which increases the interest in the league. They have leaned into that. They leaned into that before the NFL leaned into gambling and stuff. The NBA was willing to lean into some of that, I think, a little bit more, be a little more edgier with it. The NFL, I was talking to you about this prior to the show, makes horrible decisions, in my opinion, on a lot of ways. They are very reactive. They are very influenced by public relations and what they're going to get hit by. And it's nothing is proactive about how can we make the game as good as we possibly can. And it doesn't really matter, because as bad of decisions as they continue to make, and they will continue to make football is still going to be king. It's just the way that, and it's a lot of it is fantasy football. A lot of it is the other stuff. But one of the things I think you can't say, I mean, I think the league makes bad decisions. What you said to me about Tom Brady is it was just kind of funny how a lot of what he said was probably directly inaccurate. And I'm focused on the player safety stuff. I know you had some thoughts on the idea of the mediocre play and some of the coaching things, but yeah, I mean, I don't understand the concern about, oh, the offense gets all the penalties and gets all the breaks and all this stuff. It's, I mean, do you want the league to thrive and prosper or not? Because I mean, there's no question that like people are more interested in the NFL when more points are being scored. Like everyone still talks about that Rams Chiefs Monday Night Football game a few years back. That was just like incredible. And yeah, it was like the highest scoring regular season game of all time. It was incredible as a showcase of offenses. And I'm not saying like we should just make all the rules on the offensive side, but I just got really annoyed by that comment as it related to the hip drop, Sean. Like it just kept being like, oh, how are they going to get him on the ground? Like, I don't care. Like, honestly, it's going to be 2-hand touch. Like, no, you're still going to have to tackle, but they're going to have to find a way to tackle that doesn't injure players at a rate 25 times any other injury. And I understand the hip drop stuff all came as it related to legislating head injuries out of the game and leading with the heads. And so now it's the rugby tackles and those things. But like, yeah, I mean, take those out of the game too. You're not going to get me to care. I'm a fantasy football guy. Anyway, what were your thoughts on Tom Brady's comments?
At the very least, you would have liked to have Brady waited like a few more months before coming out and, acting like the 70-year-old man. And many 70-year-olds are beautiful and wonderful and not at all like Tom Brady. But you have the situation where like not only is all of his information wrong, but so much of it is offensive, right? And you're talking about how now because of the way the NFL is officiated that the players are careless, which, I mean, neither of these things are true. I mean, you have an NFL right now that is so dangerous and where the defensive players are still so reluctant to do things appropriately that Kareem Jackson coming off of a suspension is immediately put back onto a suspension. Now, Jackson is a little bit of an outlier in that most of the players are making positive strides, but that hasn't made the game somehow safe. And the idea that players are being risky with it now because of the rules. When you think about the situation with Tua, where he suffers those concussions last season, and one of the creative things that the Dolphins did was work with him in some martial arts to work on how you fall, to avoid the damage to the head, to avoid the head hitting the ground. These teams are not just being careless with it, but they're at the very opposite end of the spectrum where they're trying everything they possibly can to keep their key players healthy, right? Despite that, the injuries at the QB position are so high that the quality of play drops. But even when you have the two superstars, the first thing that popped into my head when you talk about that Chiefs-Rams game was how boring Monday Night Football, and not boring, and there was a lot of tension in the game. There, was good defensive play, at least on the Chiefs side, and then there was really bad offensive skill position play, again, on the Chiefs side. But when you're talking about Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, you don't want to be in the second half of the game with probably the best offense in the NFL with the Philadelphia Eagles, like throwing exclusively passes 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Like that's not where we want the game to evolve to. So you mentioned the NBA and how much progress they've made. The interesting thing with the NFL might be some of the parallels to Major League Baseball, where a lot of the purists really hate the 3 true outcomes. And yet because of analytics, teams have to continually lean into things like going for those plays, like pulling the ball, even pulling into the shift. And Major League Baseball did come up with some creative solutions that didn't fix those problems, but it still made the product better. So you can have kind of both things be the case, to where you have problems you can't fix, but you also have problems that you can. And one of the things, as someone who follows a lot of Diamondbacks news and mostly exclusively baseball through the Diamondbacks, there was a huge amount of pushback to the rule changes among baseball purists, even though the rule changes seemed both A, pretty benign, and be something that probably would work to accomplish some things that baseball wanted to accomplish. And then they went out and I think they blew away actually their expectations in terms of how well they accomplished these objectives and how much fans loved it. And so you think about some things that the NFL could do, and I don't think that the NFL product is mediocre because players aren't as good when they come in from college. And one of the things we've talked about is how young players are making an impact faster. That doesn't really track with what Brady is talking about. You spent a huge chunk of the offseason, and then we've talked about it a lot on the in-season, discussing the evolution of offensive play, but beyond that, and maybe more importantly, the evolution of defensive play that has made it difficult for offenses. And that is something that when I think you contrast it with some of these older coaches is interesting, because Tom Brady is saying the coaching is not as good now. And you look at some of the people that he played with, and he played so poorly in his final season that he got his offensive coordinator fired. The offensive coordinator that was responsible for a huge chunk of what he did with the Patriots is a head coach who was fired. Bill Belichick is under fire. And one of the things that you kind of said to me in our discussions before the show is that you didn't want this to be something where we give Tom Brady enthusiasts more fuel for acting like it was all him. And it was so clearly not all him, right? You look at the time that they gave him to develop, and you look at the defensive stats and the defensive points allowed under Bill Belichick during the initial seasons and the long runway that Brady got to become who he was. And it's so clearly the coaching that was crucial there. Bill Belichick, one of the greatest coaches of all time. That stretch from the 2003 season where the Patriots really come into their own as a dynasty. They are top 10 in defensive points allowed 7 times in an 8-year stretch. And in that early stretch of dominance that allows Brady to become who he was, they go 1-2-17 and then 2-4. They have a 4-year span where they're top 5 4 times. There's just really no evidence-based or objective argument that Bill Belichick is not one of the greatest coaches of all time. The situation that we're looking at in 2023 is one of, has he been willing to evolve? Is there an issue with personnel? I think that when you look at what Josh McDaniels and Bill Belichick have both struggled with, you can make the case that it's much more personnel than it is coaching. But there are all of these interesting things going on. And football is such a complicated endeavor with the number of players interacting on both sides of the ball that it's going to be very difficult to point to specific coaching types of things. One of the things that I floated is that what Tom Brady allowed Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels to do were to create schemes and game plans that are simply more complex than what 30 to 31 teams are going to be able to do every week. And so, yeah, obviously every part of that deserves credit. And when we're thinking about what is realistic for the vast majority of coaches and what they need to do to go out and be successful, you're going to have to approach it a little bit differently. And McDaniels and Belichick, when they've had to approach it a little bit differently, have been very unsuccessful. They've been very unsuccessful doing the types of things that most coaches have to do when you don't have that type of QB. And again, with Belichick, you have this element where, he is almost certainly past his prime now. And so you have to also look at the apples and oranges there. But Ben, this trend, overall dynamic that you have articulated so well throughout the last year and even stemming back into the middle of last season with some of the things with the Falcons, what defensive coaches are now requiring of an offense can simply not be accomplished by most NFL teams. And you look at it as an issue even for the Kansas City Chiefs and Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, to where the mediocre product is directly the result of injuries and the defensive evolution. The solution for that is for coaching to be worse, right? This isn't a case where the coaches have gotten worse and the product is worse. It's a case similar to baseball where the analytics actually give you a better strategic path, and it does impact the game in a potentially negative way, which is that it's not as exciting. But you don't go back to playing with worse strategies. You could never do that. You would never do it and be successful, right? So the only answer to this is not some, weird, things were better in my day kind of just such curmudgeon-y rhetoric and nonsense. The answer is that you've got to be able to counterpunch, and or the NFL has to make some rule changes. And I'm not saying that they're going to do these, most of these rule changes are pretty far off, but one of the things that has been discussed are changes to the onside kick rules. That would make the end of games more exciting. That's a pretty niche type of thing. It's not going to affect a ton of games, but if you have a few games at the end of every week that are a little more exciting, you think about recent week here, we have all of the games decided on a last second field goal. I mean, field goals are not the exciting part of football, but having the game come down to the last play is exciting. There are things that you can do there. And you've also discussed a lot about motion being something that has been so key to counterattack, and that the young coaches, the innovative coaches, this new wave of coaches, far from being the problem and far from being mediocre, has actually been the wave that has had some answers. My argument would be that let's go the next step and allow more motion. Let's allow multiple people moving at the snap. Let's allow offensive players running at the line at the snap. Let's get rid of some of these formation penalties that take touchdowns off the board and have nothing to do with the play. People are going to argue, again, you're skewing things in favor of the offense unfairly, but what is the problem? The problem is not that offenses are putting up 50 points a game because the defense can't do anything. The problem is that defense is too dynamic. It's too dominant. So, and again, basically everything Brady has said in this diatribe works in the opposite direction of what the actual issues are at the NFL level.
One of my favorite parts of some of his rant as well is this reality that the defense has really taken over since. I mean, he wasn't good last year against the cover 2 shells before he decided to retire. His yards per attempt, all of that kind of stuff was really, really poor. All he could really do was throw underneath a lot. But, he winds up, the TD rate craters, all of those things crater. I don't think he necessarily completely lost the ability to play. Some of it was, his offensive line wasn't as good, et cetera. But it is funny because the year prior, he leads the NFL in passing TDs in 2021. They obviously won the Super Bowl in 2020. It would have been interesting to see how these defenses would have impacted him in his prime years of his career, because football was played differently on both sides of the ball. Defenses are evolving too. The sport is constantly evolving. You were talking about Bill Belichick.
Well, and Ben, to kind of finish that point off, his response in terms of the offensive guys have to be responsible for their own safety. His response with that last year was to have a time to throw number that was so low that it was just frankly non-competitive. If you're throwing the ball before you have any chance to really let the play develop, that's not taking responsibility for your own safety. It's non-competitiveness within the context of what the contest actually is.
Yep, agreed. You were talking about the Belger thing. I was just talking about the evolution. It's interesting. I was just looking back at his coaching career a little bit. Obviously, he went and coached with the Browns, but he coaches with the Patriots. He leaves or under Parcells with the Patriots, and then was he coaching with the Browns? Or he coached under Parcells with the Jets. But he learns a lot under Parcells was sort of the idea I was going to say. He coaches under Parcells with the Giants, and then he goes to the Browns as head coach. He comes back to Parcells. Takes a lot of what he learned from a really good coach and clearly wanted to be coaching under Parcells, and then is ready for his period with the Patriots to be at the forefront of a lot of things defensively. We talked about how good those defenses were early in his career. I've made the case before that Brady really benefited, and obviously you just did too. I don't think it's a hard case to make, but there are people out there that have taken Belichick struggles late in his career as a head coach. He's 71 years old. I don't know the stat, and I've referenced it a couple times, and I should look it up or figure it out at some point. But I'm pretty sure the stat was, at least at some point, that nobody 65 or older had ever won a Super Bowl or something. No head coach. And Belichick's 71 now. I mean, he was 65 years ago. There is like advances in modern medicine, and people are living a lot longer than, the 1970s, and when, there weren't coaches coaching as old, and we have more coaches that are coaching older these days. Pete Carroll is up there, etc. But there is an element of like, you have to, coaches famously work 60 hours a week, and there's a cognitive decline that starts when we're like 30, frankly, and it just continues our whole life. And so there is an element that, your ability to process and learn all these things, it's just going to get worse as you get older. I can tell you, I'm 36.
Do you feel as sharp
right
as you did 10 years ago?
No. Belichick is way up there in age, and I'm not trying to obviously be overly ageist or any of those things, but it is an element where judging him by the fringes of his careers, what he was able to do really early in his career before a second stint under Bill Parcells, what he was able to do after Brady very late in his career, doesn't make any sense. Judging Tom Brady just by the couple of years in Tampa doesn't make any sense either. And obviously it's very advantageous for the people that are big Brady fans that Brady goes on and wins the Super Bowl. But like the vast majority of these guys' career overlapped. Like we have to be able to think critically about the time they spent together. And one of the years that I wanted to point to is the year where Brady tears his ACL. It's one of the years where Belichick's in the middle of his prime and he has a lot of stuff in place where he doesn't have Brady for the whole year. And he has Matt Castle at quarterback, this young QB. Matt Castle goes on to really not be anything the rest of his career either.
I mean, the Chiefs banked on the idea that what you saw there was not a fluke and was not the product of the Patriots system. And that really set them back for years because he was.
He was. And he went on to be a backup late into his career. And even when he got spot starts, he was very clearly not special. We'll just put it that way. But with New England, was able to go 11-5 that year. It's always fascinating. They didn't make the playoffs that year. It's the one year they didn't make the playoffs, but it was way more situational than anything because back then you only had 6 playoff teams, and you had this situation where the AFC is really top heavy and also has one of those divisions that year where it was the AFC West. The San Diego Chargers win the West with an 8-8 record. The Broncos also have an 8-8 record. Then they have the Raiders are 5-11. The Chiefs are 2-14 that year. You have this really, really weak AFC West, which makes everything heavier on the other sides. But you also have, like in the AFC North, I'm looking at it right now, they had 2 4-win teams. In the AFC South, they had a 5-win team. So you had a bunch of teams at the very bottom of the AFC. This is also the 0-16 Detroit Lions year, and you have a 2-14 Rams team. So you had top-heavy teams around the NFL, and particularly in the AFC. There were only 4 10-win teams in the NFC. There were 6 in the AFC. And so the Patriots miss the playoffs because they tie for the final wildcard spot with the Ravens, and they don't get in over the Ravens. They lose the division to the Dolphins. But I'm emphasizing this season so much, and this isn't really because of anything, but the Dolphins had a point differential that year of 28, positive 28. The Patriots had a positive 101 point differential that year. The Ravens were actually tied for the NFL high with 141. So the Patriots were 40 points off the highest point differential in the NFL, but they lose the tiebreakers. They don't get to make the playoffs. It would have been really interesting to see this Patriots team in the playoffs that year. It just was one of those years. It was very, very top heavy, and that's not the way that things worked out. Regardless, no one's saying that Tom Brady's not good either, but it is just fascinating when you think through the element of like Belichick's career. His prime overlaps, his prime coaching years, the years where he is able to do the things that you talked about on defense and have an edge over other coaches and stuff, overlaps with the prime years of Tom Brady. But in the same way that he took a lot of the stuff from Bill Parcells and went on and became a great coach, and Bill Parcells, when he was off on his own after that point, was no longer a great coach, right? Like he, at his tail end of his career, was not able to do a lot with the Cowboys and whatnot. In the same way, like, yes, the game has obviously passed Bill Belichick by, and there are a lot of other coaches that are evolving. They are not coaches that have coached underneath Belichick, which I have always taken Belichick's coaching tree being so poor, I don't necessarily think other coaches having good coaching trees should be taken as a negative. But Belichick's coaching tree being so poor, I've always taken as a positive to Belichick. I think it has to be taken as something that he was able to get those coaches to be very effective underneath him because of something he was able to do. I've always thought he was must be a master of details, and he must have done a really good job over all these years of getting, starting with Charlie Weiss and Romeo Crennel and to Matt Patricia and Bill O'Brien and all of these guys focus on the things that they do very well, and Belichick taking care of all the other details and everything else. And then when those guys had to go be in charge of everything and all of the little details, that's when they started realizing, oh yeah, I relied on on Bill Belichick for a lot of these little elements that are the little edges. Not having that guy at the top makes it a lot harder. But the idea being that these coaches aren't bad coaches, but they're just better fits underneath somebody who is the real difference-making coach. And anyway, this isn't meant to be a whole episode in Belichick's favor, but it is interesting. Yes, he's struggling now. Part of the reason we went into this conversation, Sean, is as we were talking through the Brady stuff, is the coaches that Brady succeeded with are not able to succeed in this NFL. You were saying this point to me kind of before. Josh McDaniels also not able to succeed in this NFL. We have schemes evolving both offensively and defensively. The defensive ones are winning a little bit, but we do see some offensive innovation as well. And all of this is evolving in a way that is very interesting. And it would be very interesting to see players from past eras play in this current NFL. But one of the things that is true as things evolve is that a lot of this stuff, it's just getting better and better. The whole idea of defense is trying to take away explosives. That's why I keep emphasizing that's not going anywhere, because it's a whole philosophy shift. It's an understanding. Defenses have finally understood the analytics argument that vertical passing and downfield explosive plays in the passing game is why passing is more efficient. It's easier to get guys loose for these huge touchdowns when you're throwing the ball over the top of people than trying to run through 11 defenders. And it's a big part of what influences the averages and everything. And defenses finally said, well, you know what? We've always wanted to be big bullies up front and stop the run, but we actually understand now that we can let you run at 5 yards a clip. Or what the really fascinating thing about 2023 is that they've stopped allowing people to even run efficiently, or offenses to even run efficiently. But the focus is, even if we had to let you run, we are going to drop back into coverages that make it really difficult for you to beat us over the top in explosive plays. And this is another reason, we want to talk about the evolution of the game. Is another reason CJ Stroud is so fascinating as a rookie quarterback who's come in and been able to hit downfield against coverages. He'll see more things as he evolves as a quarterback, but what he's been able to do early in his career is something that other quarterbacks have not been able to do, even the good ones. Even Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes and these guys have had trouble pushing the ball downfield the way CJ Stroud has just right away as a rookie. So that's exciting from that player. But the evolution of the scheme is a focus on the intent of what they're trying to do. It's a focus on taking away something that makes offenses effective. And you couldn't run certain things that the Belichick offense is and that Brady ran in their primes against these types of defenses. It's different. It's harder. The undefeated team. I'm not saying they wouldn't have been successful, but the whole idea was predicated on, we have Randy Moss, and then we have Wes Welker underneath, who's an incredible player underneath and winning one-on-ones. We're going to stretch the field. We're going to beat you underneath. We're going to do all these things. It would have been fascinating under the current defenses to see how they could have tried to minimize Randy Moss, who for my money is probably, at least along with Calvin Johnson, probably the best receiver downfield, deep threat receiver. He's the kind of player that even, it doesn't matter what scheme you're running, what kind of over-the-top umbrella cover two shell you're trying to run. Like Randy Moss is going to out-jump triple coverage sometimes. It's just going to happen. It would have been fascinating to see some of that in this era, but I do think some of that was more effective in the era that it was in, and for good reason. It's just the point is there is always this evolution and this steady march, and so it is pretty fascinating to think about the concepts of the mediocrity and stuff. When you brought that up this morning, I thought it was a really interesting point because I don't think there's any evidence to it. If you're really tracking the game, obviously Brady knows football better than I do. He's been in the game for as long as he has. But I think if you're really tracking the way that the game is played across all 32 teams, not just on the teams that Tom Brady's playing on, the game is evolving. We, from just across Brady's career, we saw a massive increase in a ton of things. Early in his career, we were still all under center running I formations with tight ends on the field. You had fullbacks in every offense. You didn't have receiving backs because fullbacks were the receiving backs. Those guys, some of the best fullbacks were catching 100 passes a game or a year. Those got the fullbacks sort of started to be removed from the sport by, you know, the 2010 range. I don't know, like early in Brady's tenure, they actually started being one of the first teams to use those passing downs backs with Kevin Falk and some of those guys. And then you really see it with Darren Sproles and the Drew Brees teams, and that evolves into, you know, Theo Riddick on the Matthew Stafford Lions teams, and et cetera. We see more of that today, but even that has shifted back away from some of those, you know, specific role running backs that to more workhorse backs and backs that'll play on all three downs, because it was too much of a tip of, you know, the run pass splits and some of those things for a few years. But like just that shift, and then the shift into shotgun and to 3 wide receiver sets, all of that has happened in just like the last 20 years, where offenses spread out. They started to employ some of the collegiate, more spread offense, more aggressive styles, and then defenses have reacted in kind and are now saying, well, yeah, I mean, if you're going to put a bunch of extra receivers on the field and have these complex route patterns down the field and have all these explosives and destroy us, which really came to a head in the 2020 season where there was no fans on the field. And Sean, I've always sort of misunderstood the 2020 season. You always do a great job of reminding me that like the fans were a huge part of that season. The fact that the road teams didn't have to contend with any noise and were able to basically just play in a scrimmage, an August scrimmage, basically a great atmosphere for offenses on both sides of the ball in every game all season long in 2020. And the offenses really explode and the scoring explodes. And we see a lot of explosive plays and all of those things. And defenses finally say, look, this is the way offenses are going to play now. And they're able to spread things out and be this aggressive and just attack. We have to just stop that part of it first and then work our way back toward the line of scrimmage. Stop the explosives, work our way back, do the best we can. And they did that. They stopped the explosives, and now they've worked their way back to where they're stopping the run game as well. It is not mediocrity. I mean, it is evolution. I mean, that's what is happening in the NFL.
And I think the most frustrating part is just there's a selfishness to making those comments, especially when they're not evidence-based. It does a disservice to the sport that, I mean, in theory, Tom Brady loves. And you think about, again, some of these parallels with baseball, where you hear the old pitchers talking about how, you know, you've got to be able to get through that lineup the third time, even though the stats from back in the day and the stats from now show, you know, what the risks are for taking bad tactical decisions just to prove some type of macho point or to prove some type of point about what you want to see aesthetically. And the problem with Brady's comments really mirror in so many ways the problems that you have with the political system on both sides, is this element of, if you want to solve problems, then you have to have your understanding of the problem be fact-based and then present solutions that are based off of that. And so if we want to make the NFL game more exciting, which I think most of us want, there have been some excellent weeks this year. So I certainly don't want this to be a complaint about the NFL in general. I mean, there have been 4 or 5 weeks that we came on the show and like, that was amazing. But the things that Brady is talking about are the same things that we discussed on the show, is that really you do want to see what looks like a better product, like play in and play out. And then over the big picture, you want something that's more exciting from a full game perspective. To get there, we have to understand what the issues are. And if the issues are simply that the defenses are winning the strategic battle, you have to decide whether there are things within the game that then actually need to be changed, like my suggestions with allowing the offense more flexibility, or you have to be willing to understand that that's simply going to be the way the game is played, and that you have to adjust to that scoring environment and that tactical environment and embrace those battles, embrace what's happening on a play in, play out basis in this new context, because that's the environment that you have. Talking about a different environment from 5 years ago, from 10 years ago, where defenses were not playing as well, doesn't accomplish anything. And if we can do those things while we keep the players healthier, that's a perfect solution that's not antagonistic to the game. So the NFL doesn't have it exactly right. Not all the things protecting the players are perfect. Certainly when you have things that are extremely unfair to defenses, basically incorrectly called penalties, that's an issue that needs to be fixed that's separate from player safety, which is, again, another great point that you've made. But I wanted to bring this up because I do think that the NFL has some things that could be better and the game could be more exciting. But to get there, we have to understand what the problems really are. And we have to give credit to people for the great job they've done in the last 5 to 10 years of growing the game from a strategy perspective, as opposed to criticize people in that somehow the coaching is worse. That is definitely not the case. And I just want to echo your thoughts from the beginning, where I love this season. I love the listeners. I'm so thankful for being able to do the show with you. I'm so thankful for this last week did not go very well in fantasy, and I was pretty down on Sunday, and writing about the games on Monday and then just thinking through this week. Anytime that many people actually have a lot of very bad things going on in their lives. I'm so lucky in that I don't. And anytime that I go through any kind of a down period related to fantasy or anything else, it is great to, have a moment to express gratefulness, because, to talk a little bit about gratitude, because I've been incredibly lucky, as world events certainly show. Not everybody is in that ballpark. So I'm both thankful for everything I have. I'm thankful for you. And I hope the listeners are having a wonderful week. And my heart and my thoughts also go out to all the people who are not nearly that lucky right now.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. And I agree with it. It's kind of a weird pivot, but I do want to make one more football-related comment. Because you did note in there and said earlier as well that, all the rules do favor the offenses. I do just want to say, when I was, I had my little comments earlier about who cares if the offenses benefit. I do believe that. I also think there are too many rules that favor the offense. Like as a result of the player safety stuff, I don't care if it favors the offense, but there are shifts that could be made, and there are things that should be done. And some of the best responses I've gotten to when I've tweeted about the hip drop and some of that stuff are, well, what's the offense going to give up? What's the trade-off going to be? If that's outlawed, what are we going to shift so that it stays balanced? I think that's a fair conversation. I like that conversation. I want to have that conversation. I want to have that conversation as it relates to particularly my answer, and I know people don't love this, would be reviewing personal fouls, reviewing player safety penalties, because they do end up getting called too often, and then people hate the penalty. I think the penalty is okay if it's correctly applied, but sometimes you're going to have the player safety calls, the body weight, roughing the passer, and some of those things are going to be questionable, and we should be able to review them so that we don't have to take the whole player safety rule out, and they're not always misapplied in those things. I would also talk about the DPI, the underthrown deep balls, a lot of those things where teams can just underthrow a deep ball and get like a 60-yard play, 40-yard play, whatever. Yeah, I agree. The defenses do have a tough job out there, and I do agree that there should be some shifts in those regards. When I talk about the NFL regulating their sport poorly, I think they do an absolutely horrible job of regulating the game of football. I just want to be clear, and it's on both sides, offense and defense. Everything's reactionary. So many of the rules are archaic. They do not do anything proactively. The sport of football should be played at a much different level and in a different way, I think. And it could be handled a lot better. But I think the NFL really, really drops the ball on that. So it's not just that I favor offenses and I'm a fantasy football guy. I wanted to be clear on that. But I agree with you, Sean.
But before you go into the final one here, I want to go in a little bit the opposite direction and say that I think it's too easy to play defense at the NFL level now that now that the analytics are helping people understand what's important, and the defensive coaches are so good in coaching the game well. Now that you have those two pieces, the game is so skewed in favor of the defense that, as opposed to asking what the offense is going to give up, I think we have to ask, how can we level the playing field and give the offense a real chance? And maybe the best play of the week. Not the best play of the week because it was a completely irrelevant play. But when Jerry Jeudy fakes a second throw, just like randomly in the middle of running, and you can completely understand the defender's response because it's just like so out of nowhere. He's like, what is going on? It's like before your brain can, these things have to be automatic, right? Before your brain can process the fact that this is ridiculous, you like react to it. In addition to pre-snap motion, let's allow multiple
double passes.
Let's make the game fun, right? People want the game to be
fun.
My
favorite part about that is he did the bump fake and then he lowered his shoulder and truck sticked him. And so he was like, the guy kind of reacted and then he just was getting run over by Jerry Jeudy. If you're Jerry Jeudy, to run somebody over, you got to do something to throw him off first and then you can run him over. It was pretty great to watch. But yeah, no, I wanted to echo your thoughts and just say very thankful for you, thankful for the RotoViz team and everybody. And then obviously our listeners who I talked about at the beginning, but anyone who's stuck with us to through the end of this pod and is a marathon listener whenever we go this long. It's been a short week. Shawn and I are recording Wednesday. We've typically been recording on Thursdays this year. Gives me a day off after I write all of Stealing Signals all day, Monday and Tuesday. Shawn, I know you typically write on Wednesdays. You jam that into Tuesdays to be able to record with me here today on Wednesday. So both of us, maybe not on our A game, we decided to just, go with it. A little long-winded today, some bigger picture topics and thoughts. But thankful for you guys who do stick with us and listen to these shows all the way through to the end, even when we're just out here kind of spitballing a little bit. But a fun show with you, Shawn, and again, just grateful for what we get to do here.
It's been so much fun. And good luck to everybody this week. Week 12, this is a chance to make the playoffs in the FFPC contests. I'll be 3 big weeks left in most formats, and you're into your playoff push. So good luck tomorrow, Ben. There are games scattered throughout the week as far as I can tell. We'll be rooting for our teams and listener teams throughout it. Good luck in week 12. That'll be Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are following him at Yards Per Gretch. Sign up for Stealing Lines. Sign up for Stealing Signals. I'll give a personal pitch for Stealing Signals Gold. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRadio 2023 at checkout. That'll give you 10% off a 1-year subscription. And I'm sure we'll have some fun promotions down the stretch of the season as well. Really appreciate all the ratings and reviews. Those help us a ton with the algorithm. We'll talk to you guys soon.